speaks to the conversation we were having just in the first hour, earlier in the first hour, on the president's letter. And I did mention that we will be joined by Ucwenga Sihlepita, a systems thinker and an author, to help us unpack this letter from the president. The president wrote to us a letter titled, "African health security is vital to save lives and to protect jobs." And there's so much that he mentioned in this letter. He mentioned how Africa should be at the forefront of engineering its own vaccines and its own health solutions, and not always waiting on, the Western countries to come up with solutions and to tell what Africa should do, or tell South Africa what to do when South Africa is faced with a health emergency, be it a pandemic or be it whatever outbreak of whatever disease that Africa should be, facing. And he also spoke about South Africa's role as the AU champion on pandemic preparedness and the call for, African vaccine and medicine being engineered and manufactured in Africa. I don't know, man, what you felt when you read the letter. You read this letter. What was your initial thought as soon as you read it?
Good day, everyone. You see, when I read the letter B, I saw something very important with the letter. I think it's a very important letter. And I think most people would diagnose the letter in a wrong way. Sure. The letter is not a letter, it's not a problem-solving letter, but it's a problem identification letter. And I think identifying a problem is the first act of governance. And I think the president did do that right. So we should give flowers when we can,
Yeah.
I think there are just 4 things before we get into the problem of the letter. So yes, the problem does have gaps in them, which could make the whole enforcement of the whole the whole mission or vision behind the president's letter to not even be able to come into life. But the 4 things I think the president does do good in this letter is, 1, the framing is correct. Health security is equivalent to economic security, and we can never even argue that is irrebuttable.
Yeah.
So these things are interdependent. I think also the vaccine sovereignty argument is the right argument right now. I think African countries for the longest time have been so dependent on Western land for farmers, to the point where we got to see even with COVID-19, we had a structural failure because of that, because we were reliant on Western medicine.
Yeah.
I think also the argument behind the move behind African Epidemic Fund, I think that's the right move for now. I think pooling capital in Africa for emergencies, I think it's the right step to minimize dependency on Western currencies. And there's a line the president said in this letter that I loved so much. He said, "Equal partnership and not charity." Now, I think this is a very important line. I think this shows that Africa wants to move to being to be able to send or be able to implement global rules instead of just receiving them. And I think this is a great initiative, and it's a great first step that we can take. However, I think with the letter, I think the letter is a bit reactive than structural. Now, what do I mean? The letter frames Ebola, right, as a reminder. But we must also ask ourselves the question as Africans, with why is even African health systems even underfunded in the first place? And you get to see, Bana, that question is absent throughout the whole letter, which makes the whole letter no longer structural and just be a reactive letter. Because when we talk about the IMF, we must remember that because of IMF conditions and also debt service obligations that have been there for decades, they've captured health spending in Africa, and that is a problem. So we cannot talk about health security, whereas governments in Africa are wasting approximately 30 to 40% of their funding to servicing their debt. That's a problem. So it's a structural issue that we have, and I think the president's letter does not completely answer it.
So do you I'm interested in how we can move from a more reactive response to creating proactive systems that could help us address some of these issues that the president speaks about. Because when I, as an ordinary South African, reads and listens to the president speak about, manufacturing our own vaccines and making sure that we have a capable healthcare system across Africa, not just South Africa, that can address health health emergencies when they arise. I'm thinking, but that's such a good idea. I'm thinking it's not necessarily reactive because we don't have Ebola in South Africa, or at least not yet, right? So it does seem proactive that we are looking at other countries and we are trying to address the problem before it arises in our own country. So how can we move from being reactive and creating proactive systems that can help us do this? Because when I read this letter, I was thinking to myself, Utini president, when clinics in Tanzania, when clinics in Kuko, I mean Ekombo, when clinics in so many townships in South Africa are debilitating because they are under resourced, they are understaffed. When we look at hospitals are facing the very same fate. So is it really proactive when he says this? But if you look at some of the institutions, health institutions, public health institutions to be specific, they are facing the same fate. So it seems like it's a dream to me, because if you look at reality right now, reality cannot back these ideals that the president is presenting us.
Now, B, I don't blame you for seeing things like that, because there's a lot the letter is missing. Yes, the president talks about us making our own medicine, but there is no policy mechanism involved in the letter. So there could be one thing that could lead to many South Africans being able to perceive the letter the way you perceive it also, because one, the president, the president must remember that if we're going to talk about now building systems in Africa, health systems in Africa, and we're trying to bring manufacturers in Africa to be able to start building the infrastructure required for us to be able to produce these medicines, we need in Africa, one, we need to dedicate a land. We need to have a patent waiver advocacy. We need IP reform. We need procurement guarantees. We need an anchor in the market, and we cannot do all that because you get to see even with national health insurance, right? If ever it was properly implemented in Africa, that would create exactly the domestic market we need. So because the letter does not that does not really look into those things deep enough on how can we reform our IP, what are the procurement guarantees, what are we what reform are we going to dedicate in terms of pharma industrial policy, in terms of is there a guarantee in terms of government procurement for local manufacturers. So because the letter does not go deep into those things, it will not directly lead to anyone willing to even invest in African infrastructure in terms of healthcare. And if we also look deep into it, yes, South Africa, okay, let's say we are the AU champion, right? But there's no accountability framework. Who's going to keep South Africa accountable? There's no framework that tries to show us how we're going to have an accountability system, how we're going to ensure everything is done as planned. And because it is missing all those things, it makes it hard for even foreign investment to even come in Africa and build the infrastructure required for us to do what we need to do. So I think when it comes to the solutions you wanted, I think we need to stop as Africans making promises to ourselves that we cannot keep. And I think we continuously make this mistake through our leaders, because remember, there's a legislate of 15% that should be justifiable. There was I think I forgot which year this deal was made, but there was a deal that was made that African countries are going to spend approximately 15% of their national budget every single year to ensure they promote health security. But you cannot do that if ever you are taking away the 30%, 40% from the national budget before you can even implement that 15%. Because if you look into the two valuations, they're not equal. So because there is that indifference there, it creates a problem for us that makes every actionable step we want to make actionable to seem ambitious or not be able to be easily implemented.
And I think, speaking of those ambitions, and a big worry is that South Africa has pledged $13.5 million to Africa CDC for the Ebola response in Uganda and, of course, the DRC. I'm interested, is this a meaningful contribution, or is it just symbolic? And how do we evaluate it? Because it is just a pledge. $13 million is also quite a lot of money for a country that is still in debt, and for a country that nayo in itself is struggling with its own public healthcare system. So yeah, can you please speak to that? How do we evaluate such pledges in a systematic context or in a systems context?
Now, it will depend whether is South Africa going to be able to really champion Africa or champion the AU as they've promised to. Now, it can be a problem, but it can also be something beneficial. Now, why do I say so? It will be a problem if ever, one, we do not integrate BRICS Health Technology Transfer Agreement. We don't have a BRICS technology transfer agreement with, let's say, your China and Russia, because they already have the infrastructure required for us to be able to do these things. So if we as South Africa are not able to use that partnership into our benefit, I think that's where this is going to go into failure. I think also, secondly, if ever we cannot also be able to build a system where we can be able to give reasons to manufacturers to build here in Africa instead of building in Western economies or Eastern economies, I think until we can do that, we're going to have a problem. So governments have to commit to local manufacturers. There should be a commitment, and not through speeches, but through action. We should be able to see that they are starting and trying to buy so that they can be able to attract foreign investment into African countries. So it can be a failure, that 13 million USD, and it can be a failure to the point where it can be something like, we're just ambitious and just wasting money. But if ever we can utilize all the resources we have at our disposal, we ensure that we implore African countries to invest in local infrastructure, to buy from local manufacturers instead of directly buying from Western or Eastern entities, being able to use as South Africa the BRICS systems that we have and our BRICS membership that we have in BRICS, to be able to ask China and Russia to help us build these vaccines and be able to build a good trade agreement between the AU and BRICS itself. I think such a partnership can lead to success, and all this money cannot go to waste.
And how does big pharmaceutical companies in the West take this? Because they've invested so much in African countries. They've invested so much in South Africa. I mean, we now have people who still get it 370 because there was an investment during COVID to help, South Africans, with a relief fund so that they can carry themselves through the COVID-19 pandemic. Does this not risk some of the relations we have with Western countries? I mean, if you look at South Africa and its international relations at the moment, it is quite shaky. We know a lot of the companies that invested in South Africa during COVID-19 were American companies, right? It was big pharmaceutical companies from America who invested in South Africa. And so now when South Africa decides, you know what, we are trying to talk to our fellow brothers in the continent, sure, but this is what we want to do. How do you think that might impact the relations we have with these Western countries and, America being at the forefront of those countries?
I think we can avoid any detachment from the people who have helped us before. I think what African nations are trying to do is trying to put themselves in a position of strength instead of being in a position of weakness and making agreements from a position of weakness. They're trying to be less dependent on the IMF and the conditions of the IMF. And whether we like it or not, for us to be able to move forward, as long as we are dependent on the IMF for bailouts and so on, we're going to have a problem as African entities and nations. So I think if ever African, the EU, in fact, specifically, can be able to build agreements with Western powers, build agreements with your BRICS entities, your NATO, and so on. Because it's not a matter of completely detaching from the system, but being able to show them that now we want to be independent and we want you guys to stay as partners and help us build the infrastructure required for us to do these specific things. But it does not mean now, but now we want to be highly dependent on you. There's no us breathing without you guys. I think that's what African nations are trying to do now. They're trying to be able to build the local infrastructure required for them to be able to move forward, to be able to revolutionize. And we cannot really do that whether we like it or not, as long as we're dependent on the systems. So dependency, we can minimize dependency, at the same time be able to ensure that we can also maintain the partnerships we have. So it's just a matter of negotiation processes that we can have as South Africa with these other nations and African nations as a whole, with Western nations, Eastern nations, and so on, and be able to build agreements around the infrastructure of Africa itself, and be able to get the necessary resources and equipment we need from these nations, at the same time be able to stay independent through our systems and be less dependent on them.
Let's say this ideal is realized and it comes to fruition. Where do you see the role of, tenders and procurement in the whole process? Because that's also something that I thought about. I'm like, if South Africa and other African countries are coming together to form this I don't want to call it an African health organization that would respond to emergencies, but would also help facilitate improvements in the respective countries' healthcare systems. Where's the role of tenderpreneurs? We've been hearing a lot about them when it comes to hospital heists. You look at Tembisa Hospital and other hospitals across the countries that have been affected or impacted negatively by tenderpreneurs and these, procurement thingies. Thingamabob, I don't even know what to call it. But what is the role of tenders and the whole procurement value chain, if I can put it like that?
It must die. It's time now.
It
must die.
You didn't even think about that too much. You were
No.
like, death upon it now.
Then upon it now. I think for African countries to be able to be independent and be able to build the infrastructure required, I think for employment purposes, I think it's about time we start focusing less on entrepreneurs and be able to let people in our local municipalities be able to be the ones who are able to give us those services. For an example, instead of us focusing on the tender system, let's employ the people required for doing those specific services. And then yes, for things that are quite important and there's no way we can be able to get them from South African citizens or even African citizens as a whole, then that's when we can talk about, okay, yeah, let's bring in a few tender companies involved, get them involved a bit. But I think the goal of African states right now should be minimizing tender procurement and ensuring that they can be able to build the infrastructure required to be able to employ people from communities around those specific municipalities and communities, businesses and industries and so on, to ensure that they employ more of our African people, because if you don't have more money circulating in the economy, then you have a problem. So we must be able to redistribute the money to the hands of the people, to be able to also attract the manufacturers to our countries themselves, because now they'll see there's more money in circulation in the economy. And the only way to do that, the tender system has to die, and we must be able to then therefore ensure that we employ African people in their municipalities and ensure they are the ones making those goods and giving us those specific services that are required by our governments at that point in time.
Well, I like that. So we even move away from dismantling the tender system, especially when it comes to this African health organization, if I can put it as at that, not just as a way to avoid corruption, but as a way to redistribute the gains or the money back to the people so that people can participate in the economy. And that way, okay, you're so smart. It's crazy. But this letter also speaks to fair global agreements on pandemics that are built on, equal partnership rather than charity. But does Africa have the leverage it would need for it to become an equal partner with these big global players, right? Because you have to come with something on the table. So what would that agreement actually look like? And do we have the leverage to actually come as equal partners and not just as people who are at the receiving end of the partnership or of whatever is to be gained?
I don't think when they said equal partners, the president was trying to say, we are going to be equal. We'll never be equal. Remember, there are countries who have higher valuations than us, and we cannot run away from that reality. But I think they're talking about in terms of negotiation processes, because we cannot neglect the idea that foreign entities and foreign nations, they all need the resources we have in Africa. So I think when it comes to the negotiation process, I think it was the second time I was here when I talked about maybe having a unified currency under the AU. I think when they talk about equal, I think they're talking about power in terms of negotiation processes, so that they are not negotiating from points of weakness, but they're able to negotiate through their strengths, through their resources. But I think it's also about time for also our leaders to understand that it is not about what you have underneath the ground that gives you a good valuation or give you the strength to be able to be equal in a table, but it's what you do with what you have underneath the ground, above your ground. And countries like China, your Russia, your US, they've been able to utilize this for quite some time. And we as African nations, we have always had this idea that we are just going to manufacture and export, and that's it.
Yes, because what does China have underneath the ground? Yet it is one of the fastest growing economies in the world.
So what China did was they were able to take from Africa and then give us trade deals that they're going to give us a discount from their services so that we can export. Then they build the infrastructure required, they do everything they need to do, then they sell everything back to us, then they make a surplus through that, then we run at a deficit. And it's a structural problem that Africa continues to be dependent on. And I think another thing that leads to such things, because we need fast money. So if you're going to build things above the ground in an economy, it requires time. It's like fixing and trying to reform a country as such of South Africa that has a corruption problem and many issues also. So it takes time, and unfortunately African countries do not have time because they do not have the required capital to be able to withstand that time. So because of such issues, it forces our leaders to make deals and agreements towards spending quicker or finding quicker means to making money and bringing income in the economy than looking for probable solutions that can lead economies to prosperity and economic growth and also economic development. So I think it's because of that problem that we don't have the required capital yet to be able to withstand that time required for us to build the infrastructure required for us to be able to do things above the ground. I think if we can have that infrastructure above the ground, be able to utilize our resources and be on the ground, I think we can then have much gained returns. We can have much more employment because you have a primary sector, secondary sector, and a tertiary sector now. And I think that would lead to a higher numbers of employment. And we have the possibility of doing this as African nations because, for starters, we have the youngest global workforce in the world. We have young citizens across Africa. South Africa is one of the highest numbers of young people in the world. So if we can utilize the youth that we have, teach the youth the skills they need to learn, and be able to move from there. I think if we can utilize our resources above the ground, we can lead these African nations to prosperity.
Ban the tender system, utilize our resources above the ground, and then maybe we can be at the forefront of the development that we speak about. Thank you so much, Toenga, for joining us. It's always refreshing, and we learn new things every single day. Thank you. Much appreciated. See you again next week.
Next week, yeah.
It's exactly 2 minutes past the hour of 10. You are still tapped into Beyond the Grey, where complex ideas meet clarity, with myself, Baby Obutlesiwe, also known as Ipura the Jan, but you can call me OB, with you up until the hour of 12 p.m. right on the Voice Lounge